There we go. Thank you so much for agreeing to do the interview, Mr. Black. Or Professor Black. Which is it? Which would you prefer?
Walter is fine.
Okay, if you're sure, Tom Woods says he can't call you Walter just straight. In one of your previous interviews with him, he's like, "Oh, he says I can call him Walter," but anyway. So thank you so much,
Murray
Walter.
Rothbard used to insist that everyone call him Murray, so I insist everyone call me Walter.
All right.
I follow Murray in many things, including this one.
Yes, as I've gathered over the years, just as this is a quick introduction. My name is Danny Woods. I've lived in many countries. I lived in South Africa first, then moved to England, and lived in Saudi Arabia, and there's an island country called Bahrain next to it. I lived there for a little bit. My mom was working as a nurse, and I don't. My father, I don't really have one, so I had to move with my mother when I was a teenager. Then I chose to come to Japan. That was a very interesting experience. Had to learn everything from the ground up. Also moved to Australia, New Zealand. Went to university in New Zealand, and came back to Japan. My half of my family lives here now, so here in Japan. So I just thought I'd give you a bit of a background. Also, during the 2008 presidential elections, Ron Paul was introduced to me by a friend, a socialist friend, because he's like, I know you don't like the socialism people, and I know you don't really like the neocons. You should never vote for a neocon. So there's someone else I can tell you about. He came to my brother's university. He told me, and there you go. Fate changes from small little moments, and that changed everything for me. Everything. Because as a teenager, I was also a socialist, or I thought I was. I didn't really know. I mean, I was a teenager. So a lot of what my Rothbard writes about in this book, is interesting to me because that era was very, like most eras, pivotal. But he also writes about Henry Hazlitt, and you're featured in this book as well, just a little bit. He talks about Walter Block and his wife, and that got me thinking. I wanted to hear about the origins of individualist thinkers. Right, so it's not easy being an individualist, whether it's libertarian or in professional life or whatever, because you're going on it mostly alone against the tide of people. And I wanted to hear, what creates the man, right? What creates that sharp-edged carbon steel sword that just cuts through all the melees, right? So I wanted to ask about your life, and I was also reading this book, heavy book, Mises' Last Night in Liberalism, and there's very little known about his early life, about his inspirations, his fears, his dreams as a child, the influence his parents had on him, his peers growing up, and it made me realize that there's some great thinkers in the world, which I don't know where they grew up. I don't know. I've looked far and wide, try and find as much as I can, and I wanted to ask you, kind of like a systematic, from the beginning to not the end, but until now anyway. Some questions about your early life, your relationship with your teachers growing up, things like which I consider to be foundational in your moral and just center, right, as a person. So I'd like to ask, so where were you born? Which city in America?
Brooklyn, New York.
Ah, Brooklyn, New York. I've only ever heard good things about Brooklyn. Always lots of interesting people live in Brooklyn. So what was your family dynamic like? How many parents? Oh, obviously two, right?
Well, there are now 37,000 different genders. So, but I had two. My father was a man and my mother was a woman.
Okay, that's good. That at least I can share with you. And do you have any siblings?
Yes, I have a sister who's 4.5 years younger than me.
Okay. All right, so you have a sister 4.5 years. So you're the older brother.
I am the big brother.
Oh, no,
yes.
You're the older brother. I'm a younger brother. Yeah, so when you grew up...
Do you have an older sister or an older brother?
Oh, I have an older brother. He's 5 years older than me. And it can be an interesting, strange relationship sometimes. But I think that obviously siblings just change the dynamic of how you deal with people throughout your life. They're the first people you have to fight with and you have to make up with. And you have to try and convince that you're right. You have to get the candy from them, or they have to get the candy from you, and you're saying, you see, if you divide it like this, then, it's certainly helped my growing up. And when you were young, it always interests me to see, so you grew up in Brooklyn. It gets really cold. I don't really know too much about weather in New York, but...
Well, it gets pretty cold in the winter and pretty hot in the summer.
Okay. So on a typical winter's day when you were maybe before you went to elementary school, and you'd wake up and you'd go to the breakfast table, first of all, did you wake up happily, or did you have to be dragged out of bed?
Well, it was a while ago that I was 4 years old. I'm now 78. I don't really remember exactly what I was like at age 4.
Okay.
I remember one time that my mother said that this friend of mine and I couldn't make mud pies, and she wouldn't let us have water. So we produced our own water.
I see.
I remember that.
Yeah. Also, did you ever... What time did you say no to your parents, if ever, at that age? I mean, can you remember if you were a stubborn child? Did your parents ever tell you, whoa, you were such a stubborn child, Walter Block?
I'm sorry, I'm such a lousy subject. I don't really remember when I first said no to my parents. I remember one time they were very, very apologetic to me because they put me in a dark closet and I cried. But I don't remember that. I just remember them telling me that later.
Okay.
And they were very apologetic about it. But I don't remember being put in a closet, so I must have said no to be put in the closet.
Yes, yeah, because disciplining with parenting is very difficult. As I'm realizing myself with 2 young kids, and you try to fine line, and you hope you don't go overboard. And when you do, you just feel really terrible. And it's those moments of when you relate with your parents. And they relate to you, and they say, "We're sorry we went overboard." These are also things which I think it tells you a lot about your parents early on, and about yourself.
Well, I have 2 children, and I spanked them once, and I regretted it ever since. I wish I hadn't done it, but they were being a pain in the neck, so I, lightly spanked them both. Yeah. And I just felt so guilty. But, we Jews are tops in guilt. And, we have an inner track on that. So I feel guilty about a lot of things. And one of them is I spanked my kids. I remember my mother used to kick me because I would try to crawl under the bed. And I was very messy with comic books all over the place. And she couldn't reach me other than to kick me while I was hiding under the bed.
Yeah, I take care of my kids for the most part at the moment. I work from home. My wife works out. And I'm not going to put my kids in daycare for many reasons. And I find it very interesting because, my children, I have to use my hands, use my legs, drag them away. They go to the electrical equipment and no. And it's just this constant, back and forth. And then if I'm doing the dishes or doing something, the kids will gang up. And, one will distract me, the other one will go. It's quite a dynamic there. And I want to actually wrote down, I wanted to ask you about your cultural influences because, which did you read comic books? Did you just read books as a kid, as a small kid before you were 10?
Mostly comic books, I think. I don't remember. Again, I'm a horrible subject. I apologize, but I do remember comic books, lots of comic books. And comic books when I was a kid.
Okay. So when were you born? What year were you born?
1941.
1941. So do you remember anything about World War II except for when people came home and people made a hubbub on the news and the newspaper?
I remember, we had rationing, and we had little round cardboard pennies.
Okay. Cardboard pennies.
Sort of rationed pennies or maybe nickels, and they were made out of red cardboard, I think.
Interesting.
So I remember World War II in that regard, but then again, I was 4 years old when it ended, and I was born when it started, roughly. I was born in August of 41. Now, the war started in 39, but the U.S. got into it in 41. I think right after Pearl Harbor, which mean I would be 2 or 3 months old. So I don't remember that.
So,
but the aftermath of the war, I remember just in terms of rationing.
Yeah. So when you spoke to your parents about trouble in the world, or when you listened to the news on the radio, or you see your father reading a newspaper, my mother would try to explain to me some of the troubles. Like, okay, because I'd ask her, like, what's up with X, Y, or Z, and she'd say, oh, there's a war going on. And I remember as a kid, it was a very abstract thing. I mean, let alone someone dying, but if a whole group of people killing each other, it was so out of my understanding. And when I was small, the apartheid regime was changing. When I was about 5, it was pretty much certain that they were going to change at some point. And I remember even when I was 8, they were having elections, and there were these rallies, and the people on TV were saying all these things in African languages, and waving these hammer and sickle signs, and I, even at the age of 8, I had it was such an abstract subject. I didn't know, but I was interested if your parents were interested in politics, did they speak about politics or things like that?
Well, my father was a little interested. He was sort of conservative. My mother wasn't really that interested. Now, I'm Jewish, and right after World War II, it was discovered about the concentration camps.
Yeah.
And we had cousins and uncles and people like that who perished in the concentration camps. And that made an impression on me. And now I'm maybe 6 or 7 or 8 years old. And I forget exactly when it was discovered. It wasn't right after the war. It was maybe a couple of months, 6 months after the war. I forget when it was discovered. And then it percolated out.
Yeah.
And the Jewish community was, appalled and amazed and I was part of it. So I remember that.
So in your community that you grew up in Brooklyn at the time, was it mainly a tight-knit Jewish community, or?
It was sort of 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 Italian, 1/3 Irish.
Okay. All the miscreants of society are put in Brooklyn.
That's a good way to put it.
I have Irish people in my heritage, and Irish people think of Irish as romantic nowadays, or they think of Jewish as bankers or whatever. But people who are cordoned off like that in society tend to work together and try to flourish as much as they can, and they tend to become very strong personalities. I've felt over the years. Fighting against, doesn't matter what other people think. Your parents tell you you're gonna try and do well at school, and then you're gonna go and do whatever you're gonna do, because there's no one else in society is gonna help you in that situation. I always found that to be a commonality with many really good political thinkers, is that much like Mises was, where he grew up, it was it wasn't exactly the most welcoming place either for Jewish people. Yeah.
True.
And, so also, what was your relationship with your friends like, if you remember your friends from that year, going through elementary school? Did you guys fight? Did you guys argue over sports?
Well, what age are we now talking about?
Oh, sorry. Going from about 5, 6, going through elementary school, that era.
Well, I remember the Irish kids used to beat me up. Oh. I don't hold you responsible for that. But,
me?
No, I don't hold you responsible, but I remember that. We're now in grade school up to 8th grade, and I remember that, and I remember playing football in front of my house, and punch ball, and slap ball, sort of like baseball, only you punch a Spalding ball, a pink ball. Now maybe a blue ball.
Yeah.
I remember I was very interested in athletics. I wasn't ever really good at it, but I was interested in it, and I participated. Football, baseball, softball, handball. I started playing one-wall handball when I was in Brooklyn, maybe in 8th grade, which means I was about 13 or so.
Okay, interesting. So in that era, you liked athletics, and it's been my experience that there's two kinds of kids who like athletics. Kids who are, who are really smart and they're also really good at athletics, or they just appreciate the participation. And there's also kids, I suppose, like myself. I hated school. So the only thing which I could do, which wasn't academic because it was so arbitrary, I would just like play rugby or, run or, whatever it was. That was something I could do with other kids that didn't get me shouted at during the class. Because when I was a child, it was always stop looking out the window, don't write notes, things like that. So what kind of kid were you at school? Were you like one of those bookworms?
I remember another thing. I would always get A's.
Oh, okay.
But then at the back of the report card, it would always say, could do better and does not play well with others.
Oh.
I would inevitably get that I didn't play well with others and that I could do better.
Yeah.
And I pretty much always got A's in grade school, as I recollect. But, again, it's been a while.
Yeah. I'm sorry about the long distance in time here, but I find them interesting because, you don't play well with others. Well, I mean, you're moderate Walter Block now, but at the time, maybe not so moderate.
I must have been an extremist in those days.
Yeah.
But I wasn't a libertarian then. I didn't get converted to libertarian until I was about 20 and in college.
Yeah.
So let's now move on to high school.
Yes, indeed. That's exactly what I was going to do. So high school is a very different environment. It's your peers are different, your opinions are different. You're more separated from your parents because you're developing your own social cliques and opinions. And what would the Walter Block of high school think of the Walter Block now? Would he be like...
The Walter Block then was mainly interested in girls and sports.
Okay.
And not really politics. But I was on the track team. I was a long-distance runner. I ran half-mile cross country, which is 2.5 miles.
Yeah.
And the most memorable person there was Bernie Sanders. He was on the track team with me. And, he's now running for president. He was running for president 4 years ago.
Yeah.
He was one of the best runners in the whole city. And I was a mediocre runner. And the joke I like to tell about him is that Bernie Sanders doesn't run away from things. Like he didn't run away from socialism when socialism was unpopular.
Yeah.
He now favors, convicts voting.
Oh, yeah.
And he was criticized for that, and he didn't run away from that. But there's one person from who he did run away from, and that's me, because he was much faster than me.
Right from the start line.
We started off on the same starting line, and all of a sudden he ran away from me. So that's my joke about him.
Okay.
But my views were roughly the same as his, although he was interested in that stuff. I was, sure, socialism. And now let me be involved with girls or sports.
Okay.
So I wasn't really interested in politics, but I was a socialist. Most Jews were and are now socialists, and it was sort of in the atmosphere.
Yeah, at the time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
that would be like in the 1950s.
I remember something else that happened. I believed in God, and I was bar mitzvahed at age 13. And then when I was about 15 or 16, I read David Hume's Inquiry Concerning Natural Religion, and that turned me into an atheist.
Oh, just that one book?
That one book, and my parents were very unhappy with me, but they were not really that Jewish. They were what's called Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur Jews, namely they wouldn't go to the temple every Saturday, but on the high holy days, all of a sudden, they would go and want me to come, and I did until I was about 15.
Okay.
But then when I became an atheist, I saw no further reason to go.
Okay.
Although I did go to the temple because they had a basketball league and they gave free breakfast, so I went there for a while. But then when I became an atheist at age 15 or so, I stopped all adherence or practice of Judaism. I still feel Jewish, and the next Hitler comes along, I'll be on the list.
Of course,
But I'm not a practicing Jew.
Yeah.
And my parents were sort of upset with me because, I was disrespectful and I didn't go to shul and I didn't, involve myself in Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah. And I didn't eat kosher. Well, they didn't eat kosher either. They weren't that into it. But
for you, it was something of an ethical or moral standpoint to say, I'm not going to, go along with it per se.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I could see. So how was your extended family? Was this a common occurrence at the time for kids at the era?
I'm not sure. I have two girl cousins that I was brought up with, and both of them are deceased, unfortunately. And I have two younger cousins who I was also sort of brought up with because my mother was very friendly with her two sisters. And my mother and her two sisters each had two kids.
Okay.
So the three sisters and the six children were sort of brought up together. The two girl cousins were about my age and my sister's age, and my younger aunt had kids 10, 12, 15 years younger than me. But we were still all brought up together, and it was sort of almost like brothers and sisters instead of cousins. And I guess my atheistic stand didn't do well with my cousins and my uncles and aunts either. They had roughly the view of my parents. None of them were very religious, but they sort of wanted me to be at least respectful of it, and I wasn't respectful of it.
Okay, yeah, well, that sounds like a teenager. So, like, through high school, what was the education like at the time? Did you go to a public high school, private high school?
Yeah, I went to a public high school, and my high school, Madison High School, was pretty famous because not only did Bernie Sanders go there, but so did Chuck Schumer, a senator, and so did Ginsburg, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court judge. And we had a whole bunch of Nobel Prize winners there. Gary Becker, my mentor later at Columbia, was a student at Madison High School. So it was a pretty high-powered place.
Okay.
And now I didn't do that well. I never got into Arista. Arista, you have to have a 90 or more.
Yeah. They
had like an 86 or an 87, so I just missed it. So I was among the smarter kids, but not really very smart. And we're all my cousins and my sister, my two girl cousins and my sister were all very smart, get 95, 96. Sort of a little bit of a goof off because I wasn't really interested in that stuff then.
You could do better.
I could do better. But the same thing occurred in college. In order to get into the Honor Society for Education, you had to have a 3.0 average out of 4, and I had like a 2.8 or a 2.7. So I was never, and even in graduate school, I was at Columbia. In order to get a good mark was an A. A bad mark was a B, and if you got a C, they'd sort of kick you out. And I got all Bs. I might have got one A and mostly Bs. So I was never really a good student. Well, a good student, but not an excellent student, whether it was in high school or college or elementary school.
So did you feel a lot of pressure, or didn't you feel pressure to achieve more? Or was it just, I can do this and I can get by and I'll just do what's necessary? Again, it was more sports and girls in high school and in college, and it didn't really mean much to me. I didn't really work hard at it. I didn't get the bug. I didn't get religion in the sense of real interested in Austro-libertarianism until I was finishing graduate school. Well, no, I was a senior in college when I met Ayn Rand, and she converted me to libertarianism. I love that story. It's so you have the gumption to go up there and just stick your head between them and say I want to debate someone. But I think the response there was telling of what I would consider to be, people would say right wing. I mean, even now, I don't agree with a lot of right wing thinkers, but they're more accepting of debates. They're more accepting of trying to speak for someone for a long period of time, and to try to do the cross conversion process where someone's trying to convince you and you're trying to convince them. It's less of an adversarial thing.
Well, I think you're talking nowadays, but in the early days, like in the 60s, they were equal. They would each be willing to debate. Nowadays, the left won't debate you because they think you're awful, or you're fascist, or despicable if you don't agree with them, and they debate you. Whereas people on the right will. Now, I'm neither on the left nor the right. I'm a libertarian, and I regard libertarianism as neither of the left nor of the right, but unique, sui generis, whatever.
So then you grow up through university, and then you go to graduate school. And Walter Block messed it up. You're supposed to you're supposed to see this curve on rent control, but you messed it up. Do it again. Did those moments make you think, maybe there's more to economics than just trying to find the right curve, or
Well, in graduate school under Gary Becker and Jacob Mincer and a few of the other people, it was mainly to stay out of the war in Vietnam.
Ah, okay.
I wasn't really into it. I mean, it was okay,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't until I met Murray Rothbard and got into Austrian economics that I really got religion.
Yeah.
And then I really worked hard and published and read a lot and was much more enthusiastic about it.
Yeah.
But this was after I had my PhD already.
Okay. So I was going to ask you about that. When you moved from your parents' apartment or house, and then you went to university, were you at a dormitory, or did you share a house?
Well, when I think when I was a sophomore in college, I moved out of my parents' house.
Okay.
And my parents were very upset with me again. They get upset with me a lot. But I had two roommates, all three of us who got PhDs. Ben Klein got a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago and was a professor for many years at UCLA.
Yes.
And Mel Fine was my other roommate, and he got a PhD. I forget where it was, but he was a professor of sociology.
Okay.
At someplace in Georgia. I forget the name of it. So all three of us roommates got PhDs and became professors.
Nice.
I guess we picked ourselves out. We each picked the other guy in the sense that we figured we would be the same or something, or we were the same path. It's similar with my son. My son, all of his friends at age 6 or 7, they all became computer nerds, as did my son. But somehow at age 6 or 7 or 8, somehow my son picked friends who would all become computer nerds. Very strange. Well, in college, my two roommates were both libertarian-ish. Ben Klein, solidly libertarian. Mel was more conservative libertarian. But I remember one rule we had when we were studying. The rule was you couldn't go into the other guy's room except if you couldn't think of a word. If you couldn't think of a word, we had a rule that you could.
That's hilarious.
You could ask the other guy. And I remember one time we shared food and we shared the money for the food, and we would go shopping once a week. And the night before we went shopping, we had 3 cans of this and 2 bottles of that, and we were speculating as to, well, how long could we last if we had just on this food?
That's hilarious.
And the next day we got double as much as we ordinarily did, because subconsciously we were all worried about running out of food.
So at the time the Vietnamese War was going on, and you decided, you obviously didn't want to go die fighting the good fight against people who, for whatever reason, are getting attacked.
Muhammad Ali once said very famously that no Vietnamese ever called me the N-word.
Yeah.
So what do I want to go 10,000 miles away and shoot and be shot at by these people? I didn't really feel that way, but I didn't want to go to Vietnam. So the way to stay out of the war was to just keep going to school. And I pretty much owe my PhD to the Vietnam War. Had it not been for the war, I was sort of into real estate at that age. I was sort of buying real estate and renting out real estate. And then, I'd go to sleep worrying about the man in building 4H or apartment 4H. His refrigerator needed to be fixed. Yeah. And I didn't want to think about that. I wanted to think about libertarianism and Austrian economics. So I sold all my real estate holdings and got out of that business.
Yeah. Entrepreneurial thinking is very all-encompassing of your entire psyche. You have to focus every moment of thought on maximizing, and you worry about everything because you don't know what's important. You have to figure it out. So that would explain, the kind of the break between the entrepreneurial side and then, the more academic side and the other side. Because also, if you do something really well, like the academic side, I mean, you even if it wasn't academic, the intellectual side you did well. You met people who were like-minded, people who were. You met Murray Rothbard, and I could only imagine what that must have been like. What was the age difference at the time between you and Murray?
Murray is 15 years older than me.
Okay.
When I met him, I must have been 25. That makes him roughly 40.
Okay. So,
And before I met him, I was sort of a Randian, objectivist, minarchist. Government is good as long as it's limited.
Yeah.
Armies, courts, and police. The way Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden converted me to libertarianism, they had me read Atlas Shrugged and Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt.
Yeah.
And what Murray did is he sort of used Henry Hazlitt against me. He said, look, you believe in privatizing garbage and privatizing libraries and privatizing swimming pools and whatever. Mm-hmm. Why can't we privatize armies, courts, and police? And in about 10 minutes, I was converted to anarchism. Sort of the light bulb went over my head. And my big problem with Murray was stomach cramps, because he would keep you laughing for hour after hour after hour, and you just sit there laughing your head off. And he was a horrible person in that regard. That's my big criticism of Murray.
You should have been a boxer. You get the stomach going with the other boxer. Yeah. He in the book Betrayal of the American Right, he actually comes off very unflattering towards Henry Hazlitt, because, as he says, Henry Hazlitt was not an isolationist, right? And he was a patriot, and he believed in World War II, and I feel like for Murray that was a real sticking point, whether someone would agree to war and not other things. So would that be true?
Well, a lot of people. Murray was another person that didn't get along well with people. But Murray, in my understanding, never broke with anyone. Yeah. Rather, people broke with him. Yes. So yes, he would be against Henry Hazlitt for that reason. But I don't think he ever broke with Henry Hazlitt. I mean, disagree with him.
Yeah.
And I mean, the way I see libertarianism is really three legs. One is foreign policy, the other is personal liberties, and the third is economics. Yeah. Now, Henry Hazlitt would be very good on economics, but on foreign policy, he was no good. And I'm not sure about Henry Hazlitt's view on personal liberties. Like, did he favor legalizing prostitution and drugs and gambling and other wicked kinds of things?
I think I view Henry Hazlitt as almost a socialite of the classical liberal sense, in that you can't be too extreme, and he kept himself very focused on what he did well, and the things. Economics was his strong point, and and journalism and writing. So he focused on that. And I think someone like myself, or my friends, because you tend to find friends who are like you, you get in trouble. You're like a barbing bush, and there's a wool jacket coming by. The jersey gets caught on. You can't help it. It's just every little thing. You're like, but how could you say that? Because X, Y, or Z. You just, how could you support Hillary because she said she wants to nuke these countries? I mean, are you crazy? You want to nuke these people? And they, but she's a nice lady versus Trump. And.
Henry Hazlitt violated the Rothbard rule. The Rothbard rule, one of the many, many Rothbard rules, was that people specialize in what they're worst in. For example, Milton Friedman was a perfect exemplar of this rule. Milton Friedman was really good on free trade and minimum wage and rent control and occupational licensure, really good on micro issues. Yeah. What did he specialize in? Voucher system, where he's horrible, and money, where he's even more horrible. Whereas Henry Hazlitt, bless his heart, violated Rothbard's rule because Henry Hazlitt stuck to what he was really good at. Yeah. He didn't write that much about foreign policy. He didn't write that much about personal liberties like prostitution. And other people that are like that are Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams.
Definitely, yes.
They are very bad on foreign policy. They're neocons. U.S. has got to have the military here, there, and everywhere. But they hardly ever talk about it, thank God. And what they do talk about is economics, where they're just splendid.
Yes, most definitely. And especially like at the time when you had, before the modern era, when there was a clear, how could I say, understanding of, the military-industrial complex, or, I think now it's much more clear that politics for anyone, especially after Trump came in. I love that about Trump. He came in, he threw the fox in the hen coop, and everyone sees what it's like. This is crazy. It's an insane system. But at the time, I picture some people being what they consider first as patriots, and you can only go against the will of the people that much, and then you accept that this is your country and things like that. So I wanted to ask you if you ever considered yourself a patriot, for example, at the time, if there was a war that was truly, going to sweep up America and the commies would come over, and would you have ever thought about fighting in that war?
Well, Murray said there were two justified wars that the U.S. fought in. One was the Revolutionary War, or the War of Secession from England. That was a good war, and the other was the South in the War of Secession of 1861. But other than that, the U.S. wars were all imperialistic. The U.S. is not defending, it's attacking. The U.S. now has something like 800 military bases in 130 different countries. They call that defense. That's offense. I mean, if any other country did that, suppose Argentina did that and they had troops all over the place, everyone would say, well, the Argentinians are a bunch of colonialists or whatever it is, or imperialists. And I think that's roughly the way the U.S. is. So I would fight if it was a just war. I mean, if people from Canada attack the U.S. or people from Mexico or, the Martians attack the Earthlings. I'm on the Earthling side. I'm pro-Earthling, and I would, support the war if it was a defensive war, but not an offensive war. Now, Tulsi Gabbard, who's now running for president, the good old girl, this is roughly her view. Well, it's sort of like Ron Paul's view. Ron Paul's not a pacifist. Ron Paul believes in war if we're attacked, but Ron and Tulsi and me and Murray are saying, the U.S. isn't the U.S. is not being attacked. We're attacking.
Indeed.
What the hell are we doing in Afghanistan or Iraq or Iran or any of these other countries? We have Japan. I don't know how many tens of thousands of soldiers are in Japan. What are they doing there? What are they doing in the DMZ in Korea? What are they doing in these other 130 countries? It's just crazy.
It's there's also the view. People say, oh, but the U.S. is there on the behalf and on the invitation from the Japanese, they say, right, or from the Koreans. But no, it's from the government. It's the government's inviting them.
Suppose somebody invites you to jump off a bridge. You don't have to. You don't have to. Just because somebody invites you to do something, it doesn't mean you should do it. And you should only do it if it's justified.
And people in Japan are not. It's not a popular thing here. People mostly have no opinion of politics, but if you ask them, is it right that the Americans are here? They're like, well, maybe they'll protect us, maybe we don't really know why they're there. It's for the average person, for the people who actually make up the world, it's not something they want, but it's something which a certain group of people in charge, through ill or through better, it's what they want. So it's what they want, and many people will just go along because they go along with it. But it makes me think. I was thinking about Henry Hazlitt. Just to have a quick side mission here. Henry Hazlitt wasn't really an isolationist, right? But he also favored a solid gold, backed currency. And I view those things as they're very good for each other. Because if you don't necessarily have to be an isolationist per se. If you say, no, all currency must be backed by 100% reserves. Because, World War II would not have done what it did, and the U.S. would not have dropped massive amounts of bombs and firebombs on Japanese cities, and, it would not have happened that way if everyone had to pay, right now.
Well, I really regard World War II as just sort of a follow-up to World War I. And my analysis of World War I is it started in 14 and the U.S. got in 17. But by the time the U.S. got in, the war was almost a stalemate. They were having trench warfare, fighting over 3 inches of territory and running out of soldiers. If the U.S. had just kept its big fat mouth or big fat thumb out of it, the war would have just ended. but instead the U.S. had more bonds with Britain, or the ruling class of the U.S. had more bonds with Britain than Germany, so they got on the British side. And then you had the Treaty of Versailles, which was very punitive to to Germany. Speaking of Japan, the U.S. started that war. I mean, they talk about Pearl Harbor, but the U.S. had a blockade around Japan, which didn't have many natural resources. So the U.S. started that war. The U.S. got involved in World War I, which led to the Treaty of Versailles, which led to the hyperinflation of 1923 in Germany, which led to Hitler.
Yeah.
So if the U.S. had not gotten into World War I, it's possible that World War II wouldn't have occurred, that the Soviets, the commies wouldn't have taken over in Russia or China. The U.S. has, got a lot to apologize for.
Yeah, and I view a lot of that because as I started studying economics when I was an adult, you realize there's roots to all of these policies, and a lot of them are economic. And it's the reason why people sometimes think, why did commies and Americans hate each other so much? I mean, it's just economic policy, but there's at the root of the two beliefs is the one is the strength of the state, and that's the identity of the people, and then there's the other where the state is another organism, is a parasite to some extent, and it's necessary for some things maybe, but people feel the elbow coming into their lives, into their families.
Well, I'm an anarchist, so I don't think the state is necessary for anything. It's a different issue.
I can wholeheartedly agree with you, and I think it was you that converted me to anarchism. So one of your old lectures from 2009, 2008, more black hair on your beard, and you did the jumping over a hurdle to represent the minimum wage and what it does to people, and it's that very passionate I think as an individualist, as anyone who's an anarchist, as I think you'd have to be if you're a complete individualist, because everyone's an individual, and you have to be passionate to pursue that course in life. So this gets me to, during that time, just after you met Ray Rothbard, and you met your wife, and it's an interesting thing being someone who's basically a thorn bush going through society. People either get caught with you or they run away because you're crazy. Being an anarchist or being, even at the time, laissez-faire, at the time it was not that popular. So did you make friends easier, or did you feel that it would impact on your personal life making friends, or did you have enough academic friends?
Well, I guess most of my friends are either academic or libertarian or from sports.
Okay.
I did a lot of sports. I used to play handball a lot. I played volleyball, tennis, and you make friends through sports, or I did and do. But most of my friends are ideological, fellow libertarians. After I got my PhD, I taught at Baruch College and Rutgers Newark.
Yeah.
I made friends with people who are now associated with the Mises Institute. I've been heavily involved with the Mises Institute pretty much all of my adult life, and I have many friends there. Then I didn't get tenure at Baruch. I didn't get tenure at Rutgers. I didn't get tenure at SUNY, State University of New York at Stony Brook. And then I went off to the Fraser Institute in Canada, which was sort of a public policy think tank to try to make Canada more free enterprise. And I lasted there about 12 years, and then I got fired because I was a little too free enterprise for them. And they like to characterize themselves as free enterprise, and they are moderately free enterprise, but I was way more, and I had difficulties with the management of Fraser Institute. And then I went off to Holy Cross University and stayed there for 6 years. And again, I didn't get tenure because I would challenge my colleagues to debating, and I would kick their butt, and they didn't much like it. I don't understand why, but I enjoy debating, always have, and still do. I do a lot of that. And then I spent 4 years at the University of Central Arkansas, and then I think I wasn't going to get tenure there, but then I came here to Loyola University with tenure.
Okay.
And I tell you, they would have fired me 15,000 times if I had not had tenure coming in.
Yes.
So I was just lucky to get tenure, and I've been here ever since. So that's sort of my bringing up my career up to date.
Okay, yeah. It's interesting when you're a professional, at least more than personal life. I mean, if you're doing sports, you can relate to sports. If you're professional, you can at least have professional colleagues, much like, I mean, Mary Rothbard had, people who objected to his political views or economic views, but when he wrote Conceived in Liberty, it was, it's everything I can see. I've looked at old reviews, book reviews, and people will be like, I don't know what all this, this economic stuff he keeps mentioning, or why, this, that, and the next thing. But in terms of its academic work, the work speaks for itself. And, I'd like to believe, especially as an adult, if you put the work in, people will recognize it.
I have to tell you another story about working and Murray Rothbard. In my early days of writing, what I would do is I'd keep a record of how many pages I would do per day. Page was 300 words. So if I did 5 pages, that was 1,500 words, and I would say that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And a lot of days I made 1,500 words. Not every day, but a lot of days. So one day I got up early in the morning, 8 in the morning, and I worked until 2 in the morning the next day, and I had like 25 pages. Which was, a world's record for me. I never had quite that much publication writing in one day. So I called Murray and I said, well, how many words or pages can you write in a day? And Murray goes, who keeps track? And I kept pressing and pushing him, and finally he said, what was it? He does. In 3 hours, he did 8 pages an hour. In 3 hours, he did as much as I did in about 15 hours.
That's ridiculous.
And I used to think that there were 5 Murray Rothbards because how could any one person write all that much? But a good typist could go faster than Murray.
Yeah,
a good typist could go 100 words a minute. Murray wasn't that fast, but he could do 1,500 words in 3 hours, 500, triple what I could do. Yeah. And now I can understand why he was able to write so much, because he was very, very fast. And he didn't work that well. He had a weird schedule. He'd go to bed at 5 in the morning or some crazy like that, and get up at 2 in the afternoon and sort of do a lot of writing at night. Yes. When he didn't have, people would leave at 2 or 3 in the morning, and then he'd start working. Yes. He had a very strange schedule. But the thing that impressed me about him was that he wrote so much per hour, which was just really.
I know it's almost at the end of the time for the interview, but another thing about Rothbard, he just seemed to be 2-3 steps ahead of himself always in everything he was doing. And he'd give a lecture, and there'd be this tumbling, rumbling water of, like a river just coming down behind him of these words and ideas, and then he'd laugh about something and he'd giggle, and the lecture would sort of stop for 5 seconds, and he'd be giggling, and then he'd say what it was, and it's this infectious nature. There's not that many lectures where you can listen to him or watch him, but just this bubbling up of ideas and thoughts, and very inspirational, for me.
No, he was a different writer than a speaker. As a speaker, he was sort of, this point, that point, all over the lot. Whereas when he writes very, very well organized. Yes. Everything follows everything. Whereas a speaker, he's, half the time he's giggling, or, it's just a pleasure to see. In other words, he was very extemporaneous in speaking. Yes. I think, he wasn't good in the sense of, what most people think of as a good speaker. But I thought he was magnificent. Amazing. Because he shared his charm with you. Whereas writing, he's sort of like Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, just
formulaic. Exactly right.
Beautiful. Just beautiful and well organized. Whereas the speaker is sort of all over the lot. But it was so much fun. I remember another story I have to share with you about Murray. Murray once said, he was talking about gold, and you can't have what do you call it, currency, fiat currency.
Yes.
And then he said, if I put on a piece of paper 10 Rothbards, nobody would give me anything. And I raised my hand. I said, Murray, I'll sell you stuff for 10 Rothbards. He said, shut up.
Right.
You know I was kidding.
Yes.
But I tell you, if he wrote it on a piece of paper, 10 Rothbards, and I still had that,
it'd be worth something. It'd be worth a lot.
So Murray was wrong.
I've one more question. It's about I love music, and I love Mozart and Bach. I'm less so Beethoven, more Mozart and Bach. And Strauss.
Those are my favorite composers.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, by the way, I have to tell you another story. My son's name, I wanted to name him Wolfgang. And my wife said no. We compromised. His middle name is Amadeus.
Ah, there you go. Okay.
And I wanted to name my daughter Johanna after Johann Sebastian. And we compromised with Hannah.
Okay, that's beautiful.
I didn't want to name my kids after politics because who knew what they would believe in. My son is a libertarian, my daughter isn't, but when they were born, I wanted to name them something that was just so beautiful and wonderful, and you can't do better than Mozart and Bach.
Yeah, eternal masterpieces, stand the test of time, actual classics. And that's my final question is, when you go home or you're in the car, do you listen to music?
Oh, yeah. I listen, and when I'm writing, the only problem is sometimes if I just listen, it's okay, then I can write. But if I'm watching them play, it's hard for me to write because it's just so gorgeous.
Yes.
To see them actually play. But I do listen to music in the car and sometimes when I'm writing, and I'll try just not to watch it, but to listen to it. Yeah, I get inspired by Mozart and Bach and Handel and Haydn and Vivaldi and the boys.
All the best old classics there. Thank you so much for your time. I very much appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for running me through my life.
Yeah, it's a passion of mine speaking to people who inspire me because I've lived in all these countries and you meet people and you don't know how long you can be with them and you'd like to find out what made them who they are. But it's been fantastic hearing about your trials and tribulations at school and almost there but not quite there, and it's been an honor. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me on your show. I greatly appreciate it. Take care.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.